Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you will never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcasts on jimmyhinton.org or findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast. Here with Jimmy Hinton, and I am flying solo today. We have some sickness that's running through our house, and so we're doing some quarantining, and I just didn't want to expose my mom to any of the fun stuff that's being carried around in my house. So I talked to her and just decided that I would record today, and then she's going to pick up with me again next week. So I wanted to hit on an article, a blog post that I posted yesterday that really took off a lot more than I thought it would. And the title of that article that I posted yesterday is called "Submitting to Church Leaders Isn't as Biblical as You Think." And I'll give you a little bit of background about this, why I wrote this, because I just hear a lot from survivors of abuse that talk about church leaders who tell them that they need to submit to them and they need to obey their leaders, and they throw these Bible verses around. And I really have studied this a lot because at our church, we appointed elders and deacons back in 2013. And so we went through a year-long process at our small church of just basically deconstructing some of the poisonous views of leadership and building up a biblical view of what leadership really looks like. So I've done a lot of study on this. This isn't something new, so it didn't just come out of thin air. This has been on my mind for years now. And I've always struggled with this idea of obedience to church leaders, at least the way that we use that term. So I'll give a little bit of background to this, and hopefully this is helpful for people who experience leadership that tells you those sorts of things, that you need to obey them, you need to be submissive to them, because quite frankly, it's just not a biblical concept. So I want to break that down a little bit for you and maybe give you some helpful things that you can come back to your leaders and talk to them and say, look, I appreciate where you're coming from, but this idea that you guys hold all the power and all the authority in the church, and that you make all the decisions and we need to just submit to that and follow your lead. It's not so much a biblical concept. So, all right, I want to first start by pointing out the two passages that are commonly used. One is in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17, and the other is in, Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25. So, start with the first one, and I'm going to give you my translation. This is my translation from the original language, from Greek, and I pointed out in my blog post, I'm not a Greek scholar, but I did take a couple years of Greek, and one of the things that you learn pretty early on is that anytime that we translate something from one language to another, doesn't matter what the language is, something gets lost in translation. So Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17 is one of those passages, and it's the only passage in the New Testament where this word obey is used in relationship to leadership. And it's kind of unfortunate that the word obey is used there, because that's not what the sense of the word means. So here's my translation. Here's my translation of Hebrews 13:17. Be persuaded by those who go before you, and yield, for they watch over your souls, as one's about to give an account, that they may do it with joy and not groaning, for this is not beneficial for you. Okay, so first of all, be persuaded. The word is peitho, and it literally means to be persuaded by. And if you remember King Agrippa, when King Agrippa was talking to Paul, and Paul had been arrested, Paul appealed to Caesar, and he's talking to King Agrippa, and Paul starts trying to convince him of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And at one point, King Agrippa interrupts Paul, and he says, "Paul, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian?" That word is peitho, same exact word that's used here in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. It means to be persuaded by, or convinced of something. It doesn't mean to obey. It doesn't mean to bow down. And so literally, I just don't understand why the word obey is used by translators, except that sometimes translators carry their own baggage and they bring their own interpretive lenses whenever they translate verses. And so, my best guess is that you just had a group of men that, at the time that they translated, preferred the word obey instead of be persuaded by. It can mean obey, but I think obey is just, it's too harsh of a translation. For the word peitho, obey is too harsh of a translation. So if you think about King Agrippa wasn't like, Paul, in such a short time, do you cause me to obey you? Can you imagine Paul telling the king that he needs to obey him? Yeah, King Agrippa, you need to obey me. That is not the sense of that word. And so Agrippa, when he says, "Paul, do you think that in such a short time that you would persuade me to become a Christian?" That's exactly what this word means. So be persuaded by, our English translations say leaders, obey your leaders. But really the next word means those who go before you. That's what it means by leader. Again, when we translate leader, we lose a lot in the translation, but literally the sense of that word means people who go before you, people who lead by example, people who are out walking in front of you. So be persuaded by those who go before you, and yield. Yield is a much, 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 much better translation than submit. That word does not mean to bow down to or submit. It means to yield to somebody willingly. And so I gave the example in my article about yielding to people when you see a yield sign and you're merging onto a highway. So I used to drive truck, and anytime that I saw a yield sign, guess what I did? I yielded to traffic that was already on the highway. So as I merged, I didn't come out there, in my rig, in my 80,000 pound rig, and say, "You need to submit to me. I'm bigger than you, and I have more power than you, and I have the authority to come into this lane." That's not what yielding is. Now that's what submission is. Full submission can definitely mean you need to get behind somebody no matter what. That's not the sense of this word. The sense of this word is to yield to somebody willingly. And it's for everybody's benefit. It's not, obey them because they're your leaders. That is not at all what this verse means. It's just not. That's a horrible, horrible interpretation of what this verse means. So yield to them. And this is interesting. Listen to the next part. For they watch over your souls. It's not because they're leaders. It's not because they're elders or ministers or whatever they are. It's not because of position. It's a yielding to them. The people who go before you willingly yield to them because they're watching over your souls. These are people who are concerned for you. They care for you. It's basically like saying when you come into the ER, yield to your doctor. Don't resist your doctor. Because if your doctor has the best interest, your best interest in mind, you yield to that. You yield to that person and you allow them to care for you. That's the sense of this passage. And then the next part of that, they're as one's about to give an account, that they may do it with joy. That they may do what with joy? Lead you? No. They may watch over your souls and do that with joy. So it's this willful yielding to the people who watch over your souls so that they can watch over your souls and do that with joy. And not groaning, for this is not beneficial for you. The whole point of this passage is the benefit not of the leaders, but the benefit of the people who yield to those people who are going before them because they're watching over your souls. So anyway, I think this is really in line with Jesus' mission. Jesus' mission was to free the oppressed, set the captives free, preach good news to the poor, to heal the blind. I think that includes the spiritually blind. So if you think about Jesus' mission and that Jesus was all about justice, we always talk about the love of Jesus, and we even twist that because we strip justice from love. Well, Jesus' love was rooted in justice. And how do we know that? Well, clear back in the Old Testament, as far back as you can go, the Bible talks about God's justice. That's his foundation. Psalm 89:14. It says that righteousness and justice are the foundation of God's throne. And steadfast love goes ever before him. It's God's righteousness and his justice form the foundation of God's throne. So I think it's really important for us to understand that God is a just God, and God is God who sent his Son to free the oppressed, to come in to execute justice because of his love, and to free people who were under oppression. God never meant for leaders of the church to become oppressive themselves and to wield all this power and to have authority over people. It's just not a concept that's found in Scripture. In fact, I gave some passages where Jesus talks about this. And Jesus says that, the Gentiles, they lord it over. They lord it over people. Here's some passages that are in this article. Jesus said in Matthew 28:18, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Jesus holds all the authority, not us church leaders. I've got news for church leaders, and I'm a church leader. We don't have authority. It's not ours. We don't have it. Jesus has all the authority, both in heaven and on earth. And then I said that Peter agrees with him because Peter says this in 1 Peter 5:11. To him, that is God, be the power forever and ever. Amen. All the power and the authority belongs to God. It doesn't belong to us. So what does the Bible consistently say? Says things like this. Jesus says, that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. So it's about being a servant. It's about serving others. It's about leaders being submissive to the people who they serve, not the other way around. It's not about saying, well, I'm a leader of the church and you need to submit to my authority. That's total nonsense and it's not biblical. So I'm going to back up too, because Julie Roys wrote an article just the other day. Let's see, this was January 18th. And the title of her article is Pastor of Harvest Bible Chapel, Naples, asks for his church back in wake of James MacDonald controversy. So this is John Sechrist, who was, until he wrote this letter, the lead pastor of the church in Naples, Florida, Harvest Bible Chapel, Naples. Here's a letter that he wrote to his church. Dear Harvest Naples friends, I want you to know that I have asked the elders to reverse their decision to allow Pastor James, that's James MacDonald, to preach in Naples while on his sabbatical as outlined in the elder update sent to you Wednesday, January 16, 2019. This request was denied. The good intentions of our ministry partnership with Harvest Chicago have been overshadowed by these developments. Furthermore, when we entered into this agreement, there was not a disclosure of the investigative reporting which led to a lawsuit and the resulting fallout. I am grieved over my own failure of leadership to not stand firm in objections I raised during the process of making this agreement. I allowed my fear of man and my own insecurities to compromise my responsibility to protect our church. Please forgive me. These, among other factors, lead me to the conclusion that this agreement is not in the best interest of our local church in Naples. Therefore, I have asked our agreement to be revoked for our local autonomy and self-governance to be restored to Harvest Naples. I will continue to serve you as long as God allows. My heart for you and our vision for God's church in Naples has not changed. I am praying for you and trust God to guide you in your decisions. Please feel free to reach out to me as needed. My request to the Harvest Elders is included below. You are loved, John Sechrist, lead pastor, Harvest Bible Church, Naples. First of all, I want to give a little bit of background. So, Harvest Chapel in Naples was an autonomous church, but the elders decided that they wanted to basically come under the authority of Harvest in Chicago and become the 8th campus of Harvest Chicago. And so John Sechrist kind of went along with that. And he opposed it a little bit, but it sounds like from his letter that he didn't oppose it strongly enough because he was not made aware that there was all this turmoil with James MacDonald. And James MacDonald filed the lawsuit against Julie Roys and the Elephant's Debt, the bloggers at Elephant's Debt, and their wives. And so John Sechrist said, I apologize and I ask for your forgiveness because I didn't oppose this strongly enough. I think his letter to the church is transparent. As a minister myself, I read his letter and I think he did the right thing. I really do. I don't think that he usurped authority, quote unquote. I don't think that he was going behind the backs of the elders because it's clear to me that he communicated with the elders often and they basically steamrolled him and said, nope, you need to submit to our authority and what the elders say is what goes. And John Sechrist rightly stood opposed to that because the elders don't have that kind of authority. They don't. So, anyway, John Sechrist attaches his letter that he wrote to the Harvest Elders and sent that along with that email that I just read that he sent out to the church. So Julie Roys writes this, update. Sechrist informed me minutes after this posted that Harvest Bible Chapel had fired him. And then she says, update 2. Harvest just sent the following to its members. So John Sechrist sends this letter to the church asking for forgiveness, saying, I didn't agree with the decision that the elders made. I want you to know that. And I'm asking the elders to revoke that decision. And here's my letter that I wrote to the elders. So he sends that to the church. They immediately fire him. As soon as he posts that, they fire him. And then they send this letter out to the church. The elders send this letter to the church. Dear Harvest Naples family, it is with great sadness and regret that we write to inform you that John Sechrist is no longer an employee of Harvest Bible Chapel. Guys, this is crazy. This is like crazy talk here. Okay, I'm going to keep reading this before I parse it. They go on. Despite great efforts and reasoning, John has chosen not to yield to the consensus of our local leadership team or the elders of Harvest Bible Chapel. Conversations with John over the last few months, culminating this week, have made it clear that he no longer desires to work for Harvest Bible Chapel. This drives me insane. This is total crap. These elders are basically saying, yeah, John didn't submit to us, so he made the decision. He's the one who made the decision that he doesn't want to work here anymore. That is not what John Sechrist's letter to the church says. John Sechrist's letter to the church is asking for forgiveness. It's about transparency. It's saying, look, I didn't make good decisions as a leader. I'm asking for your forgiveness, and I want to continue to serve you. The elders come back, and they're clearly agitated that John Sechrist usurped their authority, quote unquote. So let me go on. Here's the rest of the elders' letter to the church. Because of his continued unwillingness to yield to the direction of the elders, translation, because his refusal to be our puppet and do as we say, and the insubordinate email he recently sent counter to the elder direction, it became clear that he should not continue in his role. So, wait a second, I'm confused. Here they say it became clear that he should not continue in his role, which implies that they made the decision to fire him. But then, a few sentences before, they said that he no longer desires to work for Harvest Bible Chapel. So which one is it? These guys are insane. Okay, the next sentence. Our hearts are grieved as John's contributions to the Naples campus cannot be understated. We wish him, Jessica, and his family well. Bon voyage. See you later. Good riddance. Harvest Naples will continue as a campus of Harvest Bible Chapel in Chicago, with Pastor Rick Donald serving as interim campus pastor, and Associate Travis, I don't know how you pronounce his last name, as pastor of worship and leadership development. Pastor James McDonald will not be preaching this weekend. Services will continue this Sunday at 9 o'clock and 11 a.m. We recognize that situations like this often yield more questions than can be answered in one email. The local elders of Harvest Naples, Scott Stonebreaker and Fred Ananias, are available to field any additional questions. We ask for your prayers as church grieves this loss. We are believing for good things as we lean into God and His Word, standing together, the Harvest Naples leadership team and elders. Guys, this is total nonsense and it's flat out abuse. This is what abusive leadership looks like. What I just read is abusive leadership at its worst. These guys are awful. What they did to John Sechrist and how they did it. Of course, I don't know all the background. I admit that. But just based on an analysis of this letter, like they totally steamrolled him. And when he didn't, quote unquote, submit to the authority of the elders, which is an unbiblical concept, they steamrolled him and they fired him. I mean, like instantly they fired him. So the message is this: if you're an abuse survivor, or if you're a pastor, or if you're anybody in the church who opposes this kind of abusive leadership, where they hold all the power and authority, which isn't theirs in the first place, you're dispensable. They'll get rid of you. They really don't care. This is a guy who served at this church for several years now. Like, John Sechrist planted this church in Naples. And just like it's like he's a piece of trash that just got in the way and, oh, sorry, we got to get rid of you. Oh, and we're going to grieve his loss. This is insanity. This is absolute insanity. And I don't think that this is what Hebrews 13:17 means. The only place where it talks about, quote unquote, obeying your leadership doesn't even mean to obey them. It means to be persuaded by them. Be persuaded by them, because they're people who watch over your souls. And so yield to them. In other words, merge willingly along with them, because they're watching over your souls. And allow them to do this with joy. These elders are not watching over John Sechrist's soul. Certainly not his wife's or his children. And so this is what abusive leadership looks like. And this is why I get so agitated, because this whole notion that you need to submit to the authority of your leaders is not a biblical concept. I'm telling you, not just based on this one passage in Hebrews 13:17, but over and over and over throughout the New Testament, Jesus flips leadership on its head, and authority and power and all that stuff. And the only thing that Jesus says about power and authority as it relates to leaders is, you don't have it. So don't lord it over them like the Gentiles do. Don't tell people that they need to submit to you. Don't tell people to bow down to you. In fact, Jesus in John chapter 13 is washing his disciples' feet. He's literally down on his hands and knees. This is the Son of God who's down on his hands and knees, and he's washing the feet of his apostles. And he tells them, unless you do likewise, you can have no part of the kingdom. You're not my disciples. Those are powerful, powerful words. Jesus didn't say, you need to go out and you need to be the leaders of the church and tell people to submit to your authority. Jesus never said it. He never said it. He didn't give them that kind of authority. So I don't have time, because I don't want to run this long. I'll do this in another podcast, because I think it's important to really break this down. But the other passage is Hebrews 10:25, the whole do not forsake the assembly. It's interesting when you actually break that verse down and you find out what it means. When it says do not forsake the assembly, it's not talking about not showing up to church on Sunday morning. It's something completely different. It has an entirely different meaning. So in another podcast, I'll break that down. But I kind of wanted to go on this soapbox a little bit because it's fresh on my mind, and I just wrote an article about it yesterday. So if you want to read the full article, go to jimmyhinton.org. You'll find it right on the homepage, or you can go to the blog section and you can read that blog post that I posted yesterday. But I've had tremendously positive feedback from survivors of abuse saying that this is really helpful, that it just helped them to understand, where the authority lies. It lies with Jesus. It helped them to understand that churches who have leaders who say that you need to submit to them or else, that's abuse. That's spiritual abuse. And so I think we need to call it what it is, and we need to call leaders out when they say this kind of nonsense. These elders at Harvest, my opinion is that they need to be removed from leadership. They need to be removed, and they need to be replaced with servant elders, servant shepherds, shepherds who look like shepherds in John chapter 10. Those are the kinds of shepherds that Harvest needs. Not the ones that say, you're being insubordinate because you disagree with us. That's insanity, and that's abuse. So anyway, hopefully this is helpful. I hope it helps you identify when leaders are being abusive and how and why they're being abusive. And hopefully you can go back and just point out Hebrews 13:17 and show them, look, this is not about submitting to you. This is not about you have an authority over us or power over us. That's not what Hebrews 13:17 is about. Not even close. So, until next time, next week Mom will be back with me, and we'll pick up where we left off. So until we meet again, thanks for listening, and please subscribe and give us a like. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.